Anyways, besides that, thanks for being here for the last message in our series called Encounters by the Sea, where we have been following along in the stories about Jesus' ministry as they occurred around the Sea of Galilee. And so far in the series, Danny has communicated for us, and he's done well. We've talked about how Jesus has healed a demon-possessed man who was so terrifying and so strong that even though people would bind him in chains to try and protect themselves, he would break them. And Jesus went to such a man, and he healed him. Following that, he healed a lady who'd been bleeding for years. And it wasn't that he came and laid his hands on her. It wasn't that he went out of his way to try and draw her attention. Instead, she just found him in a crowd and happened to touch his garment. And that's the kind of power that resounded along this man named Jesus. Following that, Jesus fed over 5,000 men with barely any food at all. Barely any food, and he just breaks it, and he breaks it, and he breaks it, and it never goes away. It just keeps coming, and everybody has their fill. And if that weren't enough stories about the supernatural powers of God, he walks on water, and he doesn't just walk on water. Jesus shows off a little bit. He walks on water in the middle of a storm, and so it'd be hard enough just to walk on water, but now you have the waves crashing against you and the wind trying to blow you over, and he's just walking steady. And he gets in the boat, and as Danny described last week, I imagine he lifted his arms and just brought it all down, just like you would on a soundboard. And the wind stopped, and the rain stopped, and the storm just dissipated, and there was calmness. These are the stories that we remember because of their supernatural events, and sometimes because of their supernatural events, they leave us in one or two camps. On one side, we may be excited, just, wow, this is so cool, this is so powerful, I want to read more, I want to figure out what happens next, where's he going to be at next? And the other side of things, we may end up, rather than being interested in the stories, we may end up being disinterested in the stories. We may be disinterested because, well, that's just a little too supernatural for me to think that it might be true. Or maybe we're disinterested because I've heard that story about 400 times since I've grown up, and it's lost its punch on me. And so what I would challenge both groups of people today is that regardless of which of these categories you're in, today's passage has the profound potential to impact you in the way that you view Jesus' life and also in the way that you view your own life. So we're going to follow along in Jesus' journey in Mark chapter 7. You can go ahead and start turning there if you'd like to. We'll also have it on the screen here in a few minutes. But as we follow along, those of you with an interest in geography will notice that in today's passage, we're no longer by the Sea of Galilee. Jesus has moved away from the Sea of Galilee into the region of Tyre, and then moved from there into the region of Sidon. And Tyre and Sidon are both port cities along the Mediterranean Sea. So Encounters by the Sea still works as a title for us. We don't have to worry about losing that or having to rename it. So one of the interesting things about port cities is that a lot of business and traffic and economic flow happen in these cities. And so because there's a lot of money there, you can also bet that there's going to be a lot of influential people and a lot of power, people with power that are going to attend these cities. They're going to be there. And so we find Jesus there with a crowd of people following him, like Jesus normally has around him. Rarely do we see him alone. He has a crowd of people around him. He's in a place with money. He's in a place with power. He's in a place of influence. And now we have two more groups of people for today's message. We have the ministry geeks and the pastors who are thinking, this is a great place to start some ministry. There's money, there's power, there's influence. The more people you bring into church, now the more resources you have to bring more people into the church. And so this just sounds like a great idea. This is the kind of place you want to plant a church. This is the kind of place you want to begin your ministry. Now there's the other group, and probably the same ones who are disinterested in today's passage and in Jesus' ministry. This other group says, well, that seems awfully convenient. Jesus is in a place where there's lots of people, there's popularity, there's money, there's influence, and there's power. Like maybe Jesus has some ulterior motives going on. Maybe we've been hurt by the church and we distrust the church because maybe they've been a little too interested in money, power, and influence. And I understand that. You probably have pretty good reason to think that way. But the truth is about both of these categories is that both are doing the same thing. Both are looking at a story and they say, well, I don't have all the details, so I'm going to fill in the gaps. We have this natural desire when we don't know the full story to want to fill in the gaps in the story. And so when we don't know, we don't have the behind-the-scenes look at what everybody's thinking and what everybody's feeling. Instead, we guess. And these guesses are what we call assumptions. And these assumptions, unfortunately for us, are things that we don't typically keep in our heart and in our mind and in our head. These assumptions are things that we share, and we share confidently. Well, this is what happened, and this is why it happened. I saw so-and-so, he did this, he said this, and this is why it happened. And later down the road, we find out that so-and-so said this and did this for completely different reasons. And so Jesus, similarly, as we see him with a crowd in a place of money, power, and influence, he's not here because he's getting ready to start some awesome church and be with the ministry geeks. And he's also not here to gain popularity, and we'll see that here in a few minutes. So while he's in Sidon, he has this group of people around him. And while he has this group of people around him, there's also a smaller group of people that start making their way to him. And this is starting into verse 31. So he has a smaller group of people that come to him, and they're bringing somebody with him. They're bringing somebody who can't hear, and they're bringing somebody who can't speak. Probably somebody who couldn't do a lot of traveling on their own, because if you can't speak and you can't hear, you can't really communicate with people. So it's kind of an unsafe thing to travel alone. And so here he has a small little posse of people who are bringing him to Jesus in order that he might be healed, and he may not even know what's coming. How is he supposed to know that his friends are taking him to a place where he's going to get healed? What are they going to do? You can't sign that. There's no sign language at this time. And so they take him to Jesus to get healed. And Jesus does an interesting thing. The first interesting thing that he does is to push away the popularity and to push away some of the publicity that he might be getting from what he's about to do. And so he takes the man, I imagine, by the hand, and he walks him down a trail away from the crowd, away from all the people, and he starts signing to him. But how do you sign when there's no sign language, right? So, very primitive sign language. Jesus looks at him, and he takes his fingers, and he sticks them in the guy's ear. As if to communicate, you don't know what I'm about to do, but it has something to do with your ears. And then he went on and he spit on his fingers and touched the man's tongue. Well, that's kind of an odd sign, right? Why would you do that? It's kind of gross. But actually, saliva at the time was meant to have somewhat of a medicinal purpose. And so it wasn't as if to say, Jesus is saying, hey, I'm going to heal you with medicine, but it was to say, and to sign to this man, hey, I'm about to do something to your mouth that's going to heal it. Something to your ears, something to your mouth. I'm about to do something. But the signing doesn't stop there. He continues on, and you see that Jesus looks up to heaven. And he sighs, as if to communicate what's about to happen to your ears and the healing that's about to happen in your mouth is actually going to come from God, from somebody that is outside this world but cares very much about it. What we're about to experience comes from God. And this sigh wasn't just I'm tired. It was a prayer. And it was a prayer only a deaf, mute person would be able to understand, because they've never been able to put words to prayer. And so Jesus signs all of these things and communicates, I'm praying on your behalf that a God in heaven would heal your ears and your mouth. And he says the words, be opened. And the man immediately is able to speak and talk plainly. When I think about Alethea, my daughter, I don't think of a girl who can speak and talk plainly. We've not reached that adult level communication, right? And so there's a learning curve. But this man skipped the learning curve. He didn't have to deal with how to form words and to do the flashcards on memory and memorizing vocab lists for the teens in the room. He didn't have to do any of that. It just immediately he was able to speak and talk plainly. And that's not where we're going to end the story. The story continues on because Jesus does an even more awkward thing than just pulling him away from the crowd. We'll have it up here on the screen. This is what he does next in verses 36 and 37. Mark 7, chapter 36, 37. This powerful healing has just happened, and Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. What? The group over here is saying, Jesus, we just had a great opportunity to build a church and make it big and get all this influence and power and money and really build up the kingdom. And the other groups are saying, well, I thought there were ulterior motives, but maybe something else is going on here. I don't understand what's going on. I don't have the full part of the story. And he continues on, says, but the more he did so, insinuating that he didn't just say it once. He tried to keep a hush on this message. The more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. And people were overwhelmed with amazement, saying, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Because similarly, the people in this passage have lived what we have read in the past few series in this sermon. They've seen all these amazing things. They've heard all these amazing stories. They know that he has power to heal. They know he has power over nature. They know he has power just radiating off of his body. They know he has the ability just to multiply food. They know all this stuff. They've lived it. They're convinced. He does everything well. And you can imagine that the man who was healed, you point to his ears and he's just like, yeah, I want something to happen to my ears. You point to his mouth, yeah, I want something to happen to my ears and my mouth. I've never been able to speak and hear before. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. Yeah, I want you to pray to heaven. I want you to pray to God. I want something to break through. And imagine that you have all this pent-up emotion and God heals you and you're able to speak and talk plainly. And then Jesus says, don't tell anybody. What are you supposed to do? How does a deaf, mute man not tell anybody? Does that mean that now that he has the ability to hear and speak, that he never hears or speaks to anyone? That sounds terrible. Why would he go through life pretending he couldn't hear everybody, but knowing he could? And pretending like he couldn't speak when he just wanted to let it out? Clearly, Jesus had to have known that this man was not going to be able to keep it in. But why didn't he want them to share? Wasn't this good news? You see, Jesus was in an intense struggle. He was struggling between the idea of wanting to heal a lot of broken and hurting people, because he cares and he loves about people. He wants to heal us. He wants to take care of us. He wants to bless us. He wants to do all of these things. But he also didn't want to mislead people into thinking he was someone else. You see, the people of Israel at the time are expecting that a leader's going to come in. He's going to be very charismatic. He's going to be overthrowing the Roman government. He's going to release Israel from their captivity. He's going to do all these things, and he's going to be this awesome, just, amazing king who gives and gives and gives and gives and gives. But that's not who Jesus is. And Jesus knows it because Jesus knows the end of his story. And he knows that the end of his story leads him to a death on a cross. And if it leads him to death on a cross, he's not going to get there by gaining lots of money and influence and power. It wouldn't make sense for him to celebrate these kind of moments. And yet, this must have been so frustrating to Jesus, because the more effort he put into stopping the crowd, the more they spread the message. Jesus is thinking, if I could just get them to hush, I could probably go out and heal more and more and more people without gaining a huge crowd and a huge following and a huge amount of people who wouldn't let me dare be crucified. He's stuck in this tension. I don't want to mislead him, but I want to heal him. I want to help him. So there's two things that come out of this passage that we need to understand in order to understand our lives and understand the life of Jesus. The first, and they can be summed up in two statements. The first of these is, if you want to write a good story, you have to write with the end in mind. If you want to write a good story, you have to write with the end in mind. You see, the major purpose of Jesus' life, as we talked about, was to die on the cross for our sins. And if it was to die on the cross for our sins, there's no way he would have gotten there by gaining money, influence, and power. And so likewise, there are some aspects of our lives that we could celebrate that don't belong in our lives. So just as Jesus didn't celebrate this money, power, and influence idea, we should be careful about the things we celebrate. Take, for instance, if we had this goal and we thought, by the end of my life, I want to be very, very poor. I'm not trying to convict anybody because I don't think anybody has that desire. But if you wanted to be the poorest person in the world, and maybe you're reading a book about a person who wants to be poor, he doesn't want to have any money. And second chapter, after you read the intro, the second chapter says, the job promotion I got, hooray! It's just like, wait, that doesn't add up. Why is this in the story about a guy who wants to be poor? Now he's going to make more money. Now he's going to gain more influence, gain more power. It doesn't add up. It doesn't fit. And so likewise, there are things in our lives that we shouldn't celebrate. There are things in our lives that we shouldn't grieve. Instead, we need to identify what it means to win in our life. What does it mean to be successful? When we look back at the end of our life, and I encourage you to take this practice, spend some time and say, who does God want me to be, for those of you who are followers of Christ? And if you're not a follower of Christ, this is still applicable. You can say, who do I want to be at the end of my life? Do I want to be the richest person in the world? Do I want to be this? Do I want to be that? You get to kind of make yours up. For those of us who are Christians, you don't get to make yours up. It's kind of been made up for you. We have a list of things that Jesus wants us to do. It's called love God and love other people. And as we get towards the end of our life, he gives us specific callings. Some of us to be pastors, some of us to be teachers, some of us to be farmers, some of us to be about anything else. And so we need to identify what it means to win, what it means that Jesus wants us to win in our lives, and then measure everything in our life against it. If this happens, maybe you'll stop celebrating when your favorite sports team wins. Maybe you'll stop grieving when your favorite sport team loses. Because now all of a sudden, when you look at the end of your life, this sports team really doesn't have much to do with where Jesus may or may not be leading you. And maybe, to bring things a little more serious, maybe you'll stop celebrating being popular. Or maybe you'll stop grieving when your reputation is tarnished. Because maybe in the end, who Jesus wants you to be doesn't have anything to do with what other people think about you. And maybe you'll stop celebrating when your enemies fall in hard times. And maybe you'll stop grieving when it seems like your enemies are catching all the breaks in life. Because these things don't match up to who you're becoming. They don't match up to the end of your story. So ask yourself the question, what does it mean to win at the end of my life, and measure everything by your answer? The second statement we learned from this passage is that if you want to understand a story, you have to ask the storyteller. We can't just fill in the gaps. And so for the crowd in Jesus' day, it seemed like the right thing to do to tell everyone about the miracle they just witnessed. But how can it seem like the right thing to do when Jesus tells you, don't do it? I'm certain Jesus saw it coming. The crowds assumed they knew what was going on, but they were way off. They assumed Jesus was going to come back and be a strong, charismatic leader. We talked about that. But they never asked him. And they had to have known that this was not what Jesus wanted because he told them. And as much as we'd like to pretend like we're not like the crowd, the truth is we probably are. There are probably things that we observe other people say, and we observe what they do, and we form our own opinions about why they were said and why they were done. And when we share these things, as mentioned a little bit ago, these are called spreading rumors. They're not called spreading the truth. We do this in prayer requests sometimes, as guilty as we can be of that sometimes. We do that sometimes in small talk with other people. And what we end up doing is we mislead ourselves, and we mislead everybody we ever share a message with. And the person's story that we're interpreting, we tarnish it. And now everybody who's around you, everybody who you have influence over, doesn't understand why this person's doing what they're doing because it doesn't seem to match up with what you're saying and where they said they're going. So these two simple statements have the potential to change everything in your life. They'll change the direction, and they'll change the way you interact with other people. They'll change the way you talk. They'll change the way that you celebrate and the way that you grieve, the way that you act and the way that you think. But this morning I have to leave you with a question. Are you ready to write the next chapter in your story? Will the next chapter in your story automatically or all of a sudden start to regain focus towards maybe where God is calling you in the future? Will the next chapter in your story include less talking about other people and maybe talking to the other people about whom you normally talk? What will that next chapter look like? And this is something that only can be decided in prayer. So let me pray for you and we'll be dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the example you set for us. We thank you that as you came into this world through your Son, Jesus Christ, that you actually had the end in mind and you formed your life around it. Help us to live with that kind of focus. Help us to live with that kind of vision. And God, likewise, sometimes you actually told us part of the story and we didn't follow it exactly. We didn't follow your details. We made up our own story. We came up with our own perspective. And we used our money and our power and our influence to support it. God, help us not to do that with you. Help us not to do that with other people. Help us instead to directly communicate with people when we don't know all of the story. God, these things are so powerful, and they have the potential to change who we are as people who are following you. And we ask that you would give us the boldness and the courage to carry them out. We love you, God. Amen.